Okay, let's unpack this. We are tackling one of the most fundamental and, well, surprisingly circular debates in philosophy, defining the essential relationship between pleasure and desire.
It sounds simple on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Intuitively, we know they are connected. We're pleased when we get what we desire, and we often desire things we find pleasant.
Yeah, that seems obvious.
But the philosophical quest is to figure out if that connection is just, contingent, a kind of happy accident of our psychology, or if it's actually necessary.
Necessary meaning? Are they two totally separate things that just happen to link up? Or can one concept be entirely reduced to the other?
Exactly.
That's our mission today. We're diving into two major reductive theories: the desire theory of pleasure, often called DTP, and the pleasure theory of desire, or PTD.
And this whole debate really hinges on a core tension.
Huge is.
It's the tension between the phenomenal and the normative.
Okay, break this down.
Sure. When we talk about phenomenal, we mean what it feels like. The raw, subjective quality of an experience. The actual sensation.
Got it. And normative.
Normative refers to value, or what gives us good reasons for acting, what makes life genuinely good for us. Standards, basically.
Understanding this tension is really crucial for you, the listener, because whichever theory you lean towards impacts big things, right? Like ideas about well-being, morality.
Absolutely. Do we define pleasure by how it feels subjectively, or by the valuable role it plays in, say, justifying our actions or making life better?
So we need to figure out what we even want a theory of pleasure or desire to do before we decide which one works best.
Precisely. What job is it supposed to perform?
Okay, let's start with the first one then. The desire theory of pleasure, DTP. This theory kind of flips the usual script, doesn't it? It says the pleasantness of an experience is having a certain kind of intrinsic desire for that very experience while you're having it.
Right. It's a bit counterintuitive. DTP isn't saying the nice feeling causes the desire. It's saying the desire is what constitutes the feeling as pleasant. And proponents usually split this into two kinds of pleasant experiences. First, you've got pleasant sensations.
Like, imagine you're incredibly thirsty, just parched, and you take a cool sip of water. The desire is for that specific physical feeling of quenching thirst, and satisfying that desire is the pleasure, according to DTP.
Okay, that makes some sense.
Yeah.
What's the second type?
Attitudinal pleasures. These are more abstract, like being pleased that there's beer in the fridge.
So not a direct physical sensation.
Exactly. It's more about the combination of desiring a certain state of affairs, like beer being available, and also believing that state of affairs is true.
So DTP has these two categories. What's its main selling point? Why propose this slightly odd view?
Well, its great strength often comes from how it tackles its main rival, the phenomenological theory of pleasure.
And that theory says...
That theory is more intuitive. It says pleasure is pleasant simply because of its unique felt quality, its phenomenology, what it's like to experience it.
Okay, the straightforward view. So how does DTP attack that?
With something called the heterogeneity problem.
Heterogeneity, meaning diversity. Exactly. It starts with a simple observation. Think about all the different things you find pleasant. Eating rich chocolate cake, hearing a really funny joke, holding hands with someone you care about, maybe solving a tough puzzle.
Right, very different experiences.
Very different. Now, try to pinpoint the feeling itself in each case. Do they actually feel alike? Is there one single common pleasantness sensation across all of them?
Probably not. A good joke doesn't feel like chocolate cake.
Right. Most people would say they don't share a single phenomenal quality. They feel quite different.
So the initial argument from DTP is, if they don't share a common feeling, then their pleasantness can't be because of a common feeling. That sounds logical.
It sounds logical, but it might be a bit too quick. That initial argument is maybe too strong.
How so?
Well, just because pleasant things don't all feel identical doesn't automatically mean phenomenology isn't involved at all. Think about living things. They all share the property of being alive, but they don't all share the exact same physical or chemical properties.
Okay, good point. Like a bacterium and an elephant are both alive, but very different.
Precisely. So maybe there isn't one pleasure feeling, but lots of different phenomenal combinations could each be sufficient to count as pleasant. DTP proponents have to be careful not to overstate this heterogeneity point. They usually target versions of the phenomenological theory that claim all pleasures feel exactly alike.
All right, so the heterogeneity argument has limits. Does DTP have another line of attack? back.
Yes, and it brings us back to that normative idea we talked about. It's the normativity argument.
Okay, connecting pleasure to value again.
Right. Many philosophers think pleasant experiences are what they call non-derivatively good for our well-being.
Meaning they're good in themselves, not just good because they lead to something else.
Exactly, like eating vegetables is good because it leads to health that's derivative goodness. But many think pleasure is just good, period. Intrinsically good.
Okay, so how does this create a problem for the phenomenological theory?
Well, think about it. If the phenomenological theory is true, then the pleasantness is solely determined by the specific what it's like, the feeling.
Right.
So any experience with that specific feeling must be pleasant, and therefore it must be non-derivatively good for whoever experiences it.
Okay, and the problem is...
Let's use an example. Say, sour beer. Suppose I really enjoy the specific, maybe complex, bitter-sour taste profile of a particular craft sour beer. That specific phenomenology gives me pleasure.
Right, you like it.
Now, if the phenomenological theory is right, that specific feeling, the sour beer taste qual, is the pleasure. And if pleasure is non-derivatively good, then that specific feeling itself must be intrinsically good.
So
that implies that everyone, even someone who absolutely detests sour beer, would somehow benefit, their well-being would be improved, just by experiencing that specific sour beer phenomenology, because the feeling itself is supposedly the good thing.
Ah, I see. That seems really weird. Why would a feeling I hate be intrinsically good for me?
Exactly. It undermines the idea that pleasure's value is tied to the subject, to the person experiencing it. It makes the goodness weirdly objective and disconnected from the individual's own take.
And DTP avoids this.
Neatly. DTP says the pleasantness isn't in the sour beer feeling itself, but in my intrinsic desire for that feeling while I'm having it. If you don't desire that feeling, then experiencing it isn't pleasant for you, and thus not non-derivatively good for you. It ties the value directly back to the individual's motivational state.
Okay, so DTP handles the variety of feelings, the heterogeneity, and it seems to connect pleasure more closely to individual well-being and normativity. Seems strong.
It does solve those problems quite elegantly. But, and there's always a but in philosophy,
Uh-oh.
DTP faces its own serious objections. And these often stem from another common assumption made by DTP folks, that desire itself doesn't really have a specific feel.
So unlike pleasure maybe having a feel, desire is just a state, not a sensation.
Often that's the claim, no specific what it's like to desire something. And this sets up a really challenging thought experiment.
Which is?
The hedonic inversion argument, sometimes called the twin earth scenario for pleasure.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it out.
Right. Picture your last really, really pleasant day, maybe full of joy, satisfaction, relaxation. Just a great mix of positive feelings. Got it.
Okay, yeah. Fond memories.
Now imagine your phenomenal duplicate, a twin who shares the exact same what it's like experience as you, moment by moment. Same sights, same sounds, same bodily sensations, same inner subjective feelings. Identical phenomenology.
Okay, my feeling twin.
But here's the twist. DTP defines pleasure not by the feeling, but by the presence of a specific intrinsic desire for that feeling while having it. And remember, we're assuming desire doesn't have its own feeling.
Right.
So DTP has to allow for the logical possibility that your feeling twin, despite having feelings identical to yours, somehow lacks the necessary intrinsic desires that, according to DTP, make those feelings pleasant.
Wait, so they feel exactly what I felt on my great day.
Exactly the same feelings. But because they lack the specific desire component that DTP requires,
Your day wasn't pleasant.
DTP seems forced to conclude that your twin's day, despite feeling phenomenally identical to your wonderful day, might have been completely neutral, or maybe even unpleasant, just because the desire wasn't there. This is the hedonic inversion.
That feels wrong. Deeply wrong. If the feelings are identical, how can one be pleasant and the other not? Surely how it feels has to count for something.
That's the powerful intuition this thought experiment targets. It seems to violate a basic assumption that feeling good is what makes something pleasant. DTP seems to force a choice. Either accept this bizarre hedonic inversion, where feelings don't determine pleasantness,
Or what?
or you have to argue that desire does have a specific phenomenal feel after all. But if you do that, DTP gets dragged right back into the heterogeneity problems it was trying to solve by moving away from phenomenology in the first place.
Wow, okay. So it's a real bind, a philosophical vice grip, like you said.
It really is. And that's not all for DTP's problems. Critics constantly bring up causality.
How so?
Most people think, I desire that cool drink because the thought of it or the experience is pleasant. It feels like the pleasantness comes first, and motivates the desire.
Yeah, that sounds right.
But DTP flips it. It says the experience is pleasant because you desire it while having it. To many, that just feels like putting the cart before the horse.
And there's one more.
The problem of, let's call it undesired pleasure. Can pleasure exist without a corresponding desire?
Like what if you're pleasantly surprised by something you didn't want or expect?
Or think about simple pleasures in animals, maybe even human infants. Does a cat basking in a sunbeam genuinely have a complex intrinsic desire for the experience of basking while it's happening? Or is the sensation just pleasant? DTP seems to require quite sophisticated desires, even for simple pleasures.
Okay, so DTP struggles with intuition about feelings, causality, and maybe simpler forms of pleasure.
These objections really chip away at the idea that DTP offers a necessary link, suggesting the connection might just be contingent after all.
All right, so if reducing pleasure entirely to desire runs into these big hurdles, let's flip the whole thing. Let's try reducing desire to pleasure.
Exactly. This brings us to the other major reductive view, the pleasure theory of desire, PTD.
PTD, and this one argues.
Broadly, PTD argues that desiring something is fundamentally about being disposed to take pleasure in the idea of that thing.
The pleasure is in the idea, the anticipation.
Precisely. This has a long history. John Stuart Mill famously claims something like, to desire anything except in proportion as the idea of it is pleasant is a physical and metaphysical impossibility.
Okay, strong claim. So just to be super clear, PTD isn't saying pleasure is the only thing we desire.
No, that's a crucial distinction. It's not simple hedonism. If I desire, say, that cool sip of water again, the object of my desire is still the water. But according to PTD, what makes it a desire, what powers it, is the fact that the thought or idea of drinking the water is pleasant.
The pleasure is in the representation, not necessarily the final outcome.
Exactly. And PTD usually needs to assume some version of the phenomenological theory of pleasure we discussed earlier.
Why is that?
Because if DTP were true, if pleasure was defined by desire, and PTD was also true desire defined by pleasure, you'd just have a completely circular definition. Nothing would be defined.
Right. A is B and B is A. Doesn't help. Okay, so what's the main motivation for PTD? Why propose this view?
Well, much like DTP, it's often about capturing that crucial normative role. PTD wants to explain why getting what we desire is generally considered non-derivatively good for us, why desire satisfaction improves well-being.
And how does PTD do that better than other theories of desire?
It challenges rival theories, particularly simple action-based ones. Some theories just say desire is basically a disposition to act. Wanting water just means you're disposed to drink if it's available.
Okay, seems plausible.
But PTD proponents argue those simple theories fail the normative test. They can't explain why satisfying the desire is intrinsically good.
How do they show that?
Through thought experiments, of course. The classic one here is the Radio Man case.
Radio Man, what does he do?
Radio Man has this weird disposition. He just turns on any radio he encounters. He walks into a room, sees a radio, flips it on. But crucially, he gets absolutely no enjoyment from it. No pleasure, no satisfaction, no benefit. He just does it.
Like a compulsion.
Kind of. Now, if desire were just a disposition to act, Radio Man clearly desires to turn on radios. He acts on it consistently.
Okay.
But intuitively, satisfying this desire doesn't seem to make Radio Man any better off. It doesn't seem non-derivatively good for him.
Yeah.
PTD uses this to argue. See, since there's no pleasure involved, not even in the idea, it's not a real desire in the normatively significant sense. Real desires involve pleasure.
Okay, so Radio Man challenges the purely action-based view. The PTD's opponents fought back, right? They came up with a more sophisticated version.
They did. To really test PTD, they needed someone who meets all the other potential criteria for desire, cognitive, action-based, attentional, except the pleasure part. Enter Radiolad.
Radiolad, okay, how is he different?
Radiolad isn't just a simple compulsion. He's sophisticated. He actively plans to turn on radios. He thinks it's a good and rational thing to do. He focuses his attention on finding radios and opportunities to turn them on. He directs his resources towards it.
So by almost any other theory of desire, one based on planning, belief about goodness, attention, he clearly desires to turn on radios.
Exactly. He ticks all those boxes. But, and here's the crucial PTD challenge, Radiolad takes absolutely no pleasure in the thought of turning on radios. Nor does he get any pleasure from actually doing it.
His motivation is completely cold, emotionally flat.
Precisely. The argument calls it emotionally unengaged. Now, the PTD advocate looks at Radiolad and says, aha, Even though he acts, plans, and thinks it's good, since there's no pleasure involved, there's no non-derivative benefit to him from doing this. Therefore, this is the key PTD conclusion, R3 in the literature, his motivation isn't a genuine desire in the sense relevant to well-being. It proves PTD is right about what makes desires normatively significant.
It's like maybe he feels compelled to mow the lawn perfectly, plans it, thinks it's good for the property value, but feels absolutely zero satisfaction or pleasure in the thought or the act. PTD says that's not really a desire for mowing.
That's a great analogy. PTD argues it's some other kind of motivation, maybe a sense of duty or compulsion, but not a desire linked to his own good.
How do opponents respond to Radiolad?
Well, they push back on a couple of points. First, they might question if Radiolad is truly emotionally unengaged. Maybe he doesn't feel pleasure, but perhaps he feels anxiety about failing to turn on radios.
Ah, so negative emotion is still emotion.
Right. But the PTD response is usually sharp. Feeling anxious about failure isn't the same as desiring success. That's aversion to failure, a different beast. Desire, for PTD, requires anticipated pleasure.
Okay, what's the second counter-argument?
Second, and this is a bigger challenge, they question that fundamental link between desire and non-derivative good. Maybe not all genuine desires have to be intrinsically good for us when satisfied.
So maybe Radiolad does genuinely desire to turn on radios. It's just a desire whose satisfaction doesn't happen to improve his well-being, weakening the normative link PTD relies on.
Exactly. Or this often forces the PTD theorist into a kind of strategic retreat. They might say, okay, fine, maybe Radiolad has some kind of desire according to action theories. But our theory, PTD, correctly identifies the specific kind of desire that is relevant to well-being and rationality. We're defining the important subset.
Sort of carving out a specific territory for their theory.
A common philosophical move, yes.
Okay, any other major objections to PTD?
There's another interesting one called the checkered etiology argument. It often uses a bizarre example involving saucers of mud.
Saucers of mud, seriously. Philosophy is weird sometimes.
Yeah. This argument specifically targets the PTD claim that the pleasure in the idea is what rationalizes the desire or the action.
Okay, how does mud get involved?
Imagine someone suddenly starts finding the idea of making and collecting saucers filled with mud intensely pleasant. Like the thought just fills them with anticipatory joy.
Okay, strange hobby, but...
But the reason they find this pleasant isn't because of any normal learning or development. It's because, unbeknownst to them, someone secretly implanted a device in their brain that causes this specific pleasant anticipation about mud saucers. It has a checkered etiology, a weird, unnatural causal history.
So the pleasure is real, but its source is artificial and bizarre.
Exactly. Now the objection is, does this artificially induced pleasure actually rationalize the person's actions in pursuing mud saucers? Would we say they have a good reason to do it just because this weird device makes the thought feel good?
Probably not. It feels like the reason is defective because of how the pleasure came about.
That's the core of the objection. If pleasure derived from such a strange source doesn't rationalize the action, then pleasure itself cannot be the sole source of desire's rationalizing power. Something else must be involved, maybe coherence with other beliefs and values, or a non-weird origin.
Which undermines PTD's claim that the pleasantness of the idea is the fundamental reason.
Precisely. It suggests the relationship between pleasure, desire, and rationality is more complex than PTD allows.
Wow. Okay, so we've seen DTP trying to reduce pleasure to desire, and PTD trying to reduce desire to pleasure, and both run into some pretty deep philosophical problems, often related to phenomenology or normativity.
They both offer elegant potential solutions, but neither seems to perfectly capture all our intuitions or handle all the counterexamples.
Which kind of leads us to wonder, are we maybe barking up the wrong tree trying to solve this with purely philosophical arguments and intuitions? What about looking outside philosophy?
That's a great point. And it brings us to a major external challenge, the empirical one. Maybe pleasure and desire aren't just philosophical concepts, but actual natural kinds that science, particularly neuroscience, can define for us.
Effective neuroscience, right? Studying the brain's emotion and motivation systems. What does that field tell us?
Some really fascinating things, particularly from researchers like Kent Berridge. His work famously distinguishes between wanting and liking in the brain.
Wanting and liking. How do they map onto desire and pleasure?
Roughly, wanting corresponds to the motivational drive, the pursuit of rewards, the craving. This seems heavily linked to dopamine circuits in the brain. Liking, on the other hand, corresponds to the actual enjoyment, the hedonic impact, the pleasure you get when you attain the reward. This involves different circuits, often linked to opioids.
Okay, so the brain seems to have separate systems for the drive and the enjoyment.
Yes, and crucially, Berridge and others have shown these systems are doubly dissociable.
Doubly dissociable. What does that mean in practice?
It means one system can be active while the other isn't, and vice versa. They can function independently.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Studies show, for instance, that you can have high wanting with low or zero liking. Think of addiction-intense craving or wanting for a drug, even when the user gets little or no actual pleasure or liking from taking it anymore. Or lab rats might be engineered to obsessively press a lever for a food reward, wanting, but show no signs of enjoying the food when they get it, liking.
Wow. And the other way around, liking without wanting.
It seems possible, too, though perhaps harder to demonstrate behaviorally. Maybe experiencing unexpected pleasure without actively seeking it out beforehand. The point is, the brain seems to treat the motivation system, wanting desire, and the enjoyment system, liking pleasure, as separable.
Okay, if biology shows these systems are separate and can operate independently, what does that do to our philosophical theories, DTP and PTD?
It poses a pretty significant challenge, doesn't it? Both DTP and PTD rely on a necessary conceptual link, one defining the other. But if the underlying biological mechanisms for desire-like states and pleasure-like states are distinct and separable, it strongly suggests their relationship is actually contingent, not necessary.
Meaning they often go together, but they don't have to. One doesn't inherently constitute the other.
Exactly, which, if true, would seem to refute both reductive theories right off the bat, based on empirical evidence.
So how do the philosophers pushing DTP or PTD respond to this apparent biological refutation? Do they just pack up and go home?
Yeah, rarely. Philosophers, especially those interested in the normative side, ethics, well-being, rationality, often resist being completely dictated to by empirical findings. They might employ what we can call the normative maneuver.
Okay, what does that involve?
They might say something like, okay, Berridge's wanting and liking circuits are interesting biological facts about basic drives and reactions. But those aren't necessarily what we mean by desire and pleasure in the philosophically important sense.
So they redefine their terms slightly.
Essentially, yes. A DTP proponent might argue that true pleasure, the kind that is non-derivatively good for us, must involve the kind of intrinsic desire they talk about, even if mere liking doesn't. Similarly, a PTD proponent might say true desire, the kind that rationalizes action and connects to well-being, must involve pleasant anticipation, even if mere wanting doesn't.
So they're saying the concepts relevant for ethics and value might be more specific, more refined than the broader biological categories.
Precisely. They're focusing on the concepts that do the normative work they care about. Or, another response is to accept a kind of plurality of theories.
Plurality, meaning multiple kinds of pleasure and desire.
Kind of. They might concede that neuroscience correctly identifies wanting and liking as distinct natural biological kinds, but they could still argue that DTP or PTD correctly describes a different, perhaps more refined, normative kind of pleasure and desire, the specific subset of experiences that have that crucial connection to value and reason.
So there might be biological pleasure desire and philosophical pleasure desire, and they aren't necessarily the same thing.
That's one way to navigate the tension, yeah. It allows both science and philosophy to potentially be right, just about slightly different targets.
So the lesson here for you, listening, is that this whole deep dive really showcases this ongoing philosophical struggle. Is the ultimate definition found in the raw feeling, the phenomenal experience? Or is it found in the role that experience plays in a valuable rational life, its normative significance?
Exactly. That tension between the subjective feel and the objective value, between the necessary and the contingent, continues to shape how we try to understand these fundamental motivators. It forces us to get clear, not just on the terms, but on what we expect these concepts to do for us.
So what does this all mean? Well, if you lean towards that plurality of theories idea, it's quite interesting. It suggests that when you say, I desire X, you might actually be referring to two different things at once. Like maybe the underlying biological urge, the dopamine-driven wanting pushing you towards X, and simultaneously a more philosophical evaluation or feeling that getting X would be genuinely good, involving perhaps pleasant anticipation or recognized value. Two layers operating together.
That's a complex picture of our own motives.
It is. And here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on based on everything we've discussed. Think about the last thing you really truly desired strongly. Ask yourself, Was that desire primarily born from the pleasant idea or anticipation of getting it? Did the pleasure of the thought come first, sparking the desire? That would lean towards PTD. Or was the feeling of satisfaction, the pleasantness, something that only really got defined after you achieved the goal, confirming in retrospect that this was what your desire was aiming at? Making the desire primary, maybe leaning more towards DTP's structure, even if not its full reduction?
Which explanation feels truer to your own subjective experience of wanting something? The pleasant idea leading or the pleasant outcome defining?
We'll leave that thought